Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Karmiole Fellow lecture today. My name is Bronwyn Wilson, and I'm the director of the Center for 17th and 18th Century Studies and the William Andrews Clark Memorial Library. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for this talk that sounds really, really terrific. It's a pleasure to introduce the Karmiole Fellow for this year. His name is Joseph Nicolello, and he joins us for the fellowship from his doctoral studies at Temple University, which he began in 2021. He's also a fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, a Schoenberg Fellow, Medical Humanities Fellow, and a Collegium Graduate Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. He has a number of talks and articles, one that I would mention, which is in process and will be out soon with University of Pennsylvania Press Manuscript Studies. The working title is London Calling, Milton's Neo-Latin Typologies of the Roman Sojourn in Florentine Boxes and Papal Fragments. The talk is a part of the Kenneth Karmiole Research Fellowship. One of the things that the fellow does afterwards is give a talk, and I just also wanted to thank Kenneth Karmiole very much for this for the research fellowship, which has been really important for producing really exciting scholarship. The format will be a 30-minute paper by Joseph, and then there'll be 30 minutes for questions and answers afterwards. You can either use the raise hand function, and we will call on you to ask your question. You can unmute yourself then, or you can also put your question in the chat if you prefer, and we'll keep an eye on that, and I can read the question on your behalf. So the title of Joseph's talk is Disability Scholarship in Light of English Sources to 1666, Milton's Sightlessness and the Depiction of Space in Paradise Lost. Welcome, Joseph.
All right, great. Thank you very much for having me. And I just want to thank everyone at the Clark Library for all of your help over the months. And I'd like to thank Ken Karmiole. I look forward to hopefully seeing you next year. And I'd also like to thank Miles Orville for bringing this fellowship to my attention and for many other things. So I'm just going to take a second here to share my screen. And yeah, sorry, having a little technical issue here. Okay, I'm just trying to minimize this. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Yes, yeah. We can. It's good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry about that. So this talk is in 3 parts. First, a glance at some contemporary scholarship in terms of space, literary history, and disability, which guided me to my present undertakings. Secondly, an examination of source material from the Clark collection, namely some of the minor works and fragments of early modern English literature, which concern sightlessness, moving beyond surface metaphors into recurring themes and their connections with creation and bondage. Thirdly, what the fusion of these two means for Milton, born in 1608, and who by the age of 44 had gone completely blind before speaking Paradise Lost into existence. for Milton is curiously absent from spatial literature scholarship. My focus is on what fragments, manuscripts, and obscure works dealing with prescient themes can, when coupled with other relevant scholarly work, tell us about blindness and epic, the myth of the creation of what is called the world, and literature and existence. I'll thus review some recent insights regarding contemporary spatial literary studies with the Renaissance and blindness in mind, before getting into the primary sources and Milton. One of the most prolific scholars writing about space and literature today is Robert Talley Jr. However, the scholar of early modern literature cannot help but notice a curious lack of such works in his various books on the subjects. In my studies of Milton, I became interested at a certain point in just how the poet developed the landscape, as it were, of Paradise Lost, and what this means about Genesis and literature. Due to size and scope, or setting, Paradise Lost would almost undoubtedly be the most difficult of Milton's works to map. The cartographic turn in literary practice, in my opinion, stands to reap the greatest fruits from the most arduous of tasks in facing the early modern, which is a rigorous philosophical examination of what Milton is talking about when he talks about location in Paradise Lost. Such imaginative theological geography in the form of English epic verse reaches its culmination in a poet whose eyesight had for the matter given way years prior. And thus a turn to this blind vision of Genesis is, in the Petrarchan spirit of Renaissance humanism, one hopes, itself a pointing to the future. To this end, in his Topophrenia, Talley writes, "The enhanced attention to space, place, or geography in literary studies makes possible innovative approaches to traditional literary criticism, while also enabling students to make connections between textual interpretation and scholarly practices in other disciplines. For Talley, spatial studies highlight the relations between texts and the worlds represented in them, offering students new ways of seeing literature, literary history, and criticism." I'd also like to place Milton and these early modern writers in the lens of Philippe de Sand, who published just last year Early Modern Visions of Space. For de Sand, the writing of the body and the problems linked to the space it occupies becomes one of the most important preoccupations of Renaissance literature, due to the fact that the body represents a space that can only be spoken about in relation to the world it inhabits. It is, finally, the space that the body occupies, its passage through various episodes always linked to places, that permits us to situate and understand the remaining characters in a story. The spatial relativism of the Renaissance, in a way, proclaims the central position of the protagonist. The center of the narration, like the center of the cosmos and the center of the world, is the body of the individual who recounts or interprets the world. Space, for de Sand, always presupposes a cosmology. In the Renaissance, the cosmological vision is slowly eroding, and the universe is not viewed as a static place anymore. Movement is introduced. The individual's body, to some extent, follows the same rule of expansion and fragmentation. De Sand writes that a new cosmology permits a new understanding of one's place in the universe, in the sense that it generates a new private center for each individual, regardless of where the individual is physically located. Each place can potentially become the center of the universe, and by implication, the center of one's own world. Let us keep some of these thoughts in mind as we turn to blindness in literature in terms of early modern conceptual and textual space, concerning decades of a century which, for the English people, witnessed extreme hardship, were likely among the most terrible years through which the country had ever passed. Many experienced abject poverty, living desperately from one meager harvest to the next. In order to get closer to the heart of the matter, I have taken into account publications in the decades prior to Paradise Lost that are far from common in terms of analysis and scholarly debate, but nonetheless do not lack literary and political theological ramifications which correlate to my intellectual plans. These works concern early modern space, time, and empiricism through the vortices of literary narrative. Works such as News from Hell, Rome, 1641, attributed to Milton, help us contemplate what the public might take as Milton's hand, as well as his own self-reflexivity when it comes to the spatial structure of Paradise Lost and the place of sightlessness therein. The Sovereign Salve, for all its obvious metaphorical propaganda woven into the title, opens with a note to the reader that is helpful in shedding light on blindness and sight as concerns the political theology of its literary narrative. In this pamphlet, also curiously attributed to Milton, who was neither a monarchist nor a lawyer, the writer's rhetorical salve begins with a proclamation that it is reason rather than rhetoric that leads to truth. For while the former might dazzle and delude the conscience, it is truth that is synonymous with a salve for the blind. The author overlooks that the soothing properties of a salve do not cure, but provide temporary comfort, and in this regard actually mirror elements of rhetoric. The world in this pamphlet is hoodwinked and loaded with walls. Only truth and right reason can bring down the walls of falsity and erroneous revolutionary thinking within the hoodwinked world. This imagery offers a simultaneous sense of space worth noting. England is at a crossroads, although it is still within a hoodwinked world, whereby the planet itself might be considered as a hoodwinked head, and the country and city as varying degrees of conflicting ideas. Such a vision offers us a rare opportunity as well to reimagine the Augustinian dichotomy of the city of man and the city of God. The reader, rather than receiving either a state of carnal veneration or religious obedience, absorbed in the pamphlet a vision of life in the city comprised of darkness made visible through blindfolds and barriers, dividers and demarcations, mazes of walls, and a lightless hoodwinked sky. But as Reinhard Koselleck has shown us, the hoodwink, which is central to Masonic ritual, may also be a part of this construction of sight, blindness, and space in polemical discourse in terms of occult forces. No doubt, another project of mine has convinced me that a connection between the likes of John Milton, Robert Fludd, and Jakob Böhme is less tenuous than might have been imagined, if it has been imagined at all. The pamphlet also brings to light another issue worth examination in its own right, but particularly so in terms of Milton: the perpetual correlation of sightlessness and bondage. Loaded with the language of enslavement, one cannot help but think of Samson in reading the writer's dissections of Parliament, the king, truth haters, the lords and commons, and the clergy, to say nothing of the Jesuits. He writes that in order to break the law, one must have the law, and that the overthrowers themselves do not have the answer, but will themselves simply become worse than the system they overthrew in order to be swiftly overthrown themselves. Such questions summon to mind sources as diverse as Polybius on eternal recurrence and decay on one hand, and Agamben on the oath on the other. The future of the hoodwinked world is a tolerable mediocrity, he writes, which will lead to primitive times again in the world, such as the disastrous heaven that the present gates of hell are leading into. There is only one thing, the writer concludes, after discoursing at length on princes, conflict, and economics, and that is the truth. It would thus seem that an actual hatred for the truth, or reality, is in fact the guiding force for the writer behind revolution and destruction, which promises salvation, but is itself, again according to the pamphleteer, simply corrupted itself and overthrown in time. The answer to unhoodwinking the world is the vindication of sovereignty, the power and privileges executed by the lords and commons in parliament. Their enemies are blind, but the crisis is much deeper. A further examination of space and empiricism in this text could be enhanced by Robert Filmer, as well as the great Miltonist Muhammad Faisal's most recent book, Sovereignty. This pamphlet immediately dives into a condemnation of not only the citizens of London, but their very hearts. In A Pair of Spectacles for the City, we begin learning that because their hearts are filled with stupidity, the people of London are wicked and damnable. Politicians and atheists, ignorant and profane persons, have thrown the kingdom into confusion. There are two parties that can prevent the killing of the king: the king's party and those of the city who can, with the author, see clearly. It requires a pair of spectacles to envision the city as a nucleus, which keeps England more generally free from violent chaos, therein keeping the king's life intact. Published in 1647, just 2 years before King Charles was executed, the correlations with Milton's famous writings on regicide are obvious. Taken side by side with the tenure of kings and magistrates, published just 2 weeks after Charles's death in 1649, there's a sense of urgency in the Pair of Spectacles for the City that raises questions about the desperation that strikes at the heart of the idea of losing one or more senses. Whereas sight itself was a sort of king amongst the senses through centuries of late antique and medieval discourse onward. In this case, sight is correlated with clarity itself with stability, resulting in a temporal eschatological counterjustice, which summons both current affairs within Parliament, as well as allusions to biblical Egypt and Machiavelli. The space of this text becomes evident in its closing, moving from a polemical catalog of recent events and figures into an enclosed space designed to correlate with the effect of glasses being removed from one dependent on them. Here, the author's targets are admonished to behold walls and bulwarks of their own erection. The Revolutionary Republican Party is revealed composed of italicized saviors, some of them with hands uplifted to heaven, others consulting with hell itself. The walls closing in, the bulwarks just about solidified, the readministering of political theological lenses sees matters move from the allegorical into the literal. Should the city itself be made to pay taxes, the writer proclaims, the work is done. This is the moment, spatially claustrophobic and heavily laden with consistent invective, where the line of sight in the text becomes clear. City taxation will render, says the writer, the English slaves to eternity. The country persons will be left to their own devices to find meat and drink. Spending money and clothing itself shall disintegrate and vanish. Labor under such a system is synonymous with foolishness. For the author, who ends with a contradiction, we, the pamphlet reads, will live by play, but remember Nebuchadnezzar's handwriting. This reference to the book of Daniel concludes the text with a vision of preordained destruction that initially appears salvageable by the correct prescription of metaphorical glasses. But it is then revealed that beneath this more obvious metaphor that, beyond polemic, the destruction written on the wall of life is preordained. It is the fault and not the fault of beings. Predestination, reading this pamphlet, is a question that even from a secular point of view, raises questions for literary form, crisis, and critique, as well as the celestial aspirations that guide specific societies and which will in time find their poetic apotheosis in Paradise Lost. The question of tyranny and heaven is a critical element of Paradise Lost, and we can see traces of it here in George Buchanan. It is fitting that repressive government is made synonymous with the executioners of John the Baptist in Buchanan's Tyrannical Government Anatomized, with regard to the covenantal typologies of martyrdom and prophecy. It raises the question of whether deliberately getting oneself killed, such as the events that led to John the Baptist's death, as well as Christ, beget provocations that translate essentially into acts of suicide. To say that God decrees select suicides and condemns the rest. Buchanan seems to be probing what this says about the history of dogma and its place in late medieval and early modern literature, to say nothing of the phenomenology of religious life. The lack of location and hence space of this work is striking. Buchanan offers much to contemplate and is recognizably more practical with his dialogical Socratism than previous writers we've undertaken. Buchanan's characters are concerned with why some, rather than others, are inspired and guided by God. These characters are, at the same time, like dummies at the mercy of the first and last ventriloquist, who sees and sharply punishes. Merciless tyrants, on the other hand, cloak themselves in counterfeit piety. This description is set forth alongside the chorus's vision of villages where sad gravity did dwell, where modesty begets cruelty, and cruelty begets boiling wrath. Rural privacy coincides with the blessed life, recalling the bucolic strains of Virgil and Petrarch, active in various Neo-Latin poets of the Renaissance. Herod in the play contends that a king's estate is miserable on the condition that the king himself stand in awe before those that are miserable, thus insinuating that the misery of tyrants comes from a physical and mental space based on their judgment of the miserable. This condemned mirror reflects an image that sees prophets slain, the truth abhorred, and tyranny, if it is as rooted in a place of self-hatred and insanity as history seems to set forth with exacting repetition, synonymous with a matter of one's line of sight. The ambiguity of Buchanan's location extends two options. First, the prison cell within which John the Baptist waited to die, and spaces from there to Herod's hilltop palace. But the second space is more important for our purposes, and it is this: that the ambiguity of space in early modern biblical drama is predicated upon the biblical memory of both the playwright and the audience together. I see this space of biblical memory leading directly into Kant's thoughts on space, and in particular, as explicated in Sanford Budick's book, Kant and Milton, published by Harvard Press in 2010. But in Kant's metaphysical exposition, he writes, "Space is not an empirical concept which has been derived from outer experiences. For in order that certain sensations be referred to something outside me, that is, to something in another region of space from that in which I find myself, and similarly, in order that I may be able to represent them as outside and alongside one another, and accordingly as not only different, but as in different places, the representation of space must already underlie them. Therefore, the representation of space cannot be obtained through experience from the relations of outer appearance. This outer experience is itself possible at all only through that representation. Thus, the idea that space is simply the form of outer intuition and not a property of nor system of relations between independently real things in themselves finds its correlative in seemingly locationless drama. Likewise, time is merely the form of inner intuition. And for the chorus, even long life is nothing but a brittle chain, leading the way for meditations on time and eternity. For Buchanan's John the Baptist, there is no concern for the children he leaves behind now as orphans, saying, "He who believes that God his Father is, shall never be an orphan." The transportation from a dramatic death row beyond time and space, from his looming executioner's hands, into a glorious house of endless light. Like Milton, Buchanan's John the Baptist is preoccupied above all with how his light is spent. As I prepare to transition into taking the scholarly and archival materials considered thus far into a new synthesis for reading Milton in terms of space and the empirical, I offer a fragment from Richard Brathwaite's 1611, Time's Curtain Drawn, or The Anatomy of Vanity. The text offers us a literary account of the eye that is a little earlier than the aforementioned pieces. Prior to arriving at the eye, Brathwaite poetically discourses on topics such as grief, fate, property, justice, death, poverty, the benefit of imprisonment, drunken humor, and parrots. The three-page drama unfolds as a discourse between an elderly cynic and his son, a geographer. The former describes his disintegrating eyesight in terms of a mist, a cloud, and a web. He can perceive neither thief nor grocery bill, neither the lands his son maps out, nor any of his cartographic output. The geographer is offended by the cynic's tone and departs. The cynic is left alone, weary of everything. Brathwaite foreshadows Buchanan in the question of posterity. For the cynic, his other son, he says, is dimness. The geographer's departure is explained in a note as the vanity of youth. The father wishes him to die of leprosy in the hospital. The piece is striking in that it offers nothing by way of redemption. Likewise, it raises many questions in terms of literary cartography, offering a new arena to examine in conjunction with Robert Talley's ongoing work. The solemnity of the piece is enhanced by a feeling of the brief drama taking place entirely inside of the father's imagination as he goes blind. And News from Hell, Rome, also attributed to John Milton, is a pamphlet from 1641, not to be confused with 1606's News from Hell by Thomas Dekker. It is a copy of a letter written from the devil to the Pope and diverse others. The piece seems to have been examined in a scholarly light in 1943, but not since. Folly and stupidity are weighed by the pound, with a reference at one point to 10 pounds of damnable stupidity. The devil and the Pope introduce us to the homeless and those in the bondage of debt, as well as prostitutes and heretics. Their collective act symbolized for the writer a sign of fatal recompense. The Pope, the devil, and their world are caught in a triple bind. First, alterity is synonymous with disobedience to the dogmatic political order. Second, this itself transpiring exclusively for the sake of divine retribution, one not existing without the other. And third, the temporal choices that sift into a hermeneutic circle of experience and judgment must therein synthesize into the mortals being condemned to eternal shame. Such is but one of the hitherto neglected areas of othering in disability literatures that calls to mind the scapegoat mechanism, which is not isolated to a specific time or place, but is synonymous with the political theology of the human condition. This tension is simultaneously at the heart of Milton's reconsideration of Satan, Adam, Eve, and later Samson. Now that we have looked at the current state of scholarly things, as well as some neglected early modern texts in terms of space and the empirical, I believe we can turn to Milton. Milton's cosmogony is of particular interest, not only because it is glaringly absent in disability studies, but because through his imaginative constructions of heaven, hell, chaos, and the created universe, stripped of their imaginative visual component, are left solely to the imaginative faculties. In this way, the universe is revealed, not related to the imagination, but is the imagination itself, something made evident by eyesight lost, or the invisible overcoming the visible. It is, for instance, unclear if heaven is created out of chaos in Milton, and chaos is itself in Paradise Lost, a place where time and place are lost. Milton's chaos is made up of indefinite extension, designed in accordance with metaphysical dualism, while heaven and hell have what William Poole calls castle-like defensive boundaries. Within this scheme of things, the created universe is so infinitesimal that Milton can only express it by simile. This pendant world, in bigness as a star, of smallest magnitude close by the moon. And that's in Book 2, 1052 through 53. In Poole, we have a technical description of Milton's theological geography that takes the classical into account, as he notes that in Lucretius, walls separate our universe from its neighboring universes, like bubbles in a bath, whereas Milton's walls separate us from the surrounding chaos, and the present existence of other universes is unconfirmed. This is helpful, but it is also a beginning place for phenomenological description rather than the final word. In Paradise Lost, the external surface of the globe of the world is illuminated only on the side facing heaven, and the link between the two realms, writes Poole, is a version of the biblical vision of Jacob's ladder. This linking chain connects the globe, to a gem-studded gate underneath or around, depending on one's point of view, as we also need to flip our perspective vertically at this point in order to comprehend the entrance to heaven, which stretches into a crystal sea. The connecting ladders can be let down and drawn up, and that they always lead directly to the top of paradise means that Earth has to be geostatic in this universe, as written in Book 3, 501 to 39. The spatial structure is biblical, but also Homeric, as Zeus claimed that he could draw up all the other gods, as well as creation on a chain. It is pagan heroic poetry that also supplies prompts for the relative distances of hell, heaven, and the world. Milton's hell is as far removed from God and light of heaven as from the center thrice to the utmost pole. Book 1, 73 through 74. The center to the pole, writes Poole, is the distance from the center of the earth to the boundary with heaven, and thus hell is twice as far from earth is from heaven, as the poem encourages us to think of these zones as in a line, a conceit going back to Hesiod, where the distance is expressed in terms of a falling anvil. There it is 9 days fall from heaven to earth, and a further 9 days fall from earth to Tartarus. Virgil, whom Milton follows, then doubled the demonic distance. In the Aeneid, Tartarus is twice as far down as Olympus is up. But even these technical descriptions seem to me still lacking. The internal time consciousness of these unsighted cosmic landscapes still demand a task that recent developments in scholarship can help penetrate. Our issue is not whether a thing is true or not, but rather the incarnation of the invisible and the visible when we consider origins, ruins, and conceptual history in light of literary history. The reflective immanence that is at hand in Milton's bringing creation into the sphere of epic calls for a blending and drawing together that shines light on the metaphor of metaphor, an immersion in the unity of the structured process of existence, a drawing together of eternality and temporal perspective within the original temporal appearance, analogous to spatial perspective. As the temporal object is drawn into the past, writes Husserl, it is drawn together on itself and thereby also becomes obscure. But beyond the immanent sphere of objects, there lies a plane wherein modes of consciousness and the modes of spatial objects appearing, in both literary narrative and otherwise, parallel one another. The grouping together of these objects and concepts resurrect the ancient question of being, which we are, at least in theory, always in a better place to examine than we were before, with each passing second, which is to say nowhere. Each spatial aspect of Paradise Lost, I say, should be examined in terms of the early modern archive, empiricism, blindness, and the essence of manifestation, in order to get closer to the saving power of poetry itself, in order to transcend the visible and the invisible, through bringing this closer into our own daily imaginative practices, and in conjunction with political theology, through Eden, early modern providence, and fictionality, unto the solitary ways of scholarship and insight. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Could you lose your screen, please, and then we can bring everybody into the discussion.
Yep.
So thank you very much, Joseph, for complicated set of connections, and I'm keen to hear questions from any of you. If anybody wants to start us off.
Just 1 second. I'm just trying to undo the screen share here.
You're okay. We don't see your screen anymore. You're fine.
Oh,
I'm
okay, great, great.
not seeing, yeah. Can you see the gallery of, yeah?
Yep, everything is good.
Anybody for a first question? Is it Jane? Is that how you say your name?
Yes, it is. Sorry.
Okay.
You know, my
Thanks.
camera.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I'm trying to turn my camera on there so I can actually see you. Thank you so much for your talk. It was very inspiring and ambitious in its sweep. And I love that you went to figures and theology and the sort of big picture and then the intimacy of that within the human experience of bodily limitation. I have a really more kind of grounded question. I am really and have been really interested in the prosthetic aspect of Milton's compositional process, and also in the ways that that has been picked up by his subsequent biographers. So, for example, Jonathan Richardson, the art historian, in his biography of Milton, has that wonderful line: "His ears now were eyes to him," right? Talking about the ways in which various parts of his body were essentially farmed out or had the function of vision farmed out. But Richardson was also thinking really specifically about the amanuenses and the ways in which blindness actually entailed, strangely, a wider extension of the body into physical space through the process of composition. And so I'm just wondering if you've given any thought to not so much the literary dimension of what you're doing, but more to the ways that that might be grounded in the textual dimension of what Milton was engaged with. And as you probably know too, there's that wonderful book by Eleanor Brown, Milton's Blindness, where she actually proposes that Milton was not as blind as he presented himself as being, drawing on a couple of letters that he had written. And so, there's also an element of performance in this that I think might also bear on what you're doing. But I'm just wondering about how those concerns, which are, less sort of figural and philosophical, but more have to do with, the sort of nitty gritty of, producing text as a disabled writer in, early modern culture might play together in your argument. And again, thank you very much. It's a very stimulating talk.
Well, yeah, thank you. There were a number of things there that I think I'll definitely try to get to each of them. I am familiar with the book Milton's Blindness that you mentioned. I believe I still have it out from the library here. And I was, before this fellowship began, and still this is, very much an ongoing project. But I was very interested in reading some of these earlier accounts of Milton's blindness, also looking at some of the very recent scholarship. There's an author, Amrita Dar, her name is, and she recently wrote, she has a concept of blind language. Now, her and the book, I believe, from the 1930s or so, early 20th century, Milton's Blindness, I had originally wanted to incorporate both of these into a survey for like the first third of the presentation. I think that there is also a really great article that I have somewhere here that deals specifically with the question of who took down what Milton was saying, and really kind of the endless questions that can come from that. So I personally would not only like to look at the contemporary disability scholarship, but I don't know if older is the right word, but let's say less recent work on Milton's blindness. I would like to put those two together for sure. And I think that whether one is a graduate student or, professional scholar or really anything, the idea of Milton speaking these books and having them taken down really kind of reminds me of Bart and the death of the author and the question of how many forces are really going into any given text. So I think that there really is a lot there, and sort of, to hopefully give a good response to the question, I would say that I very much, in like the next phase of this project, whatever it is, want to incorporate each of those things, and to an extent have been. So definitely thinking along those lines.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Helen.
Thank you. That was a very, very, as Jane said, very rich, really deeply researched, suggestive talk. And I loved what you were doing with the kind of rhetoric of blindness, its relation, or rhetoric of space and enclosure and imagination, and also of precarity, I guess is one word I would use, that you were connecting to blindness. But like Jane, I kind of want to get back to embodied experience, Milton's embodied experience a little bit more, since it was something you mentioned at the beginning. And then I sort of lost sight of. And I guess my first question is super simple, which is, does it matter that Milton was cited for a fair amount of his life in terms of your argument? Because it's not as if he's not drawing on a visual vocabulary. Also, when we envision heaven or hell, we're always going to have to be in our imagination, right? I mean, so I'm just trying to work that through. And then I guess my other general question is, when you say disability scholarship, is there anyone in particular you're thinking about? Are you talking about specific Milton accounts of Milton's blindness, or what do you consider this work's relationship to disability studies to be?
Well, one impetus for this project was one of the contemporary scholars that I had just mentioned a little bit ago in Dar, who had first brought the idea to my attention of the concept of what she refers to as blind language, which is an analysis of Milton's works, looking at the Psalm translations and other relevant items, and kind of trying to read it in a lens of seeing how the writing is itself transformed as sight is giving way, and then eventually as sight gives way, how this blind language transforms into the later more famous poetry. So I think that that is an idea that I would like to research more and think about more. But I think to that extent, it does matter for me, and I think for Dar that Milton was cited for as long as he was, and I'm just trying to think of the question as
So that's very helpful response, actually.
Okay. Yeah.
I just think there is more you might think about doing in terms of orienting your work toward a disability studies audience, because I think there is something very rich about the potential of blindness to kind of work the imagination differently, extend the imagination differently, or reveal something about language that our assumptions about sightedness might not be able to show up. And that's what I was sort of listening for when I was listening to you.
Yeah, as you speak, and I'm reflecting on the fellowship process and some of my work and the presentation. One thing that comes to mind for me is a word that I believe was missing from what I said, but might be helpful here in terms of the referential, the visible referential, in terms of, to put it in the briefest sense, this idea that if I'm trying to describe something, let's say an apartment house in the afterlife or something to that effect, I intuitively would look around my surroundings and probably pick up on items and begin collecting descriptions that way. And I would like to explore that a little bit more, in the idea that that sense of empirical reference being canceled out, what that does in terms of what Dar is talking about in terms of blind language. And I think she offers some really interesting things in terms of disability scholarship, but also works of Shakespeare and George Herbert. And those are a few things that, with some of the things you've mentioned here, I personally now look forward to revisiting some of her work and some others and thinking a little bit more about this.
Great, thank you so much. Jonathan?
Yeah, I just have a follow-up comment and then a quick question. The comment would be, it might be worthwhile looking at the sequence of events when he does go blind, when we think he goes blind, because he was working for the State Department essentially, and tracking what the letters that he was translating. He was doing a little bit of work as a licensor at that moment, and so you could go in and look at the letters and just see that sort of process through there. I mean, he's getting pestered by petty diplomats. He's moving house a couple times in there, and then when he's continuing to work for Cromwell, he's translating letters from all across Europe. And so that might be something, just thinking about the sort of the larger scale that he then imagines in Paradise Lost. So that's just one to go back to these, the Helen and Jane's points about the kind of the grounding of this. He was not writing poetry at that moment. He wasn't even dictating poetry. He was translating state documents in that initial year. So that might be one place to look. And then my question is about conscience and sight. And I wondered if you might say a bit more. You pulled that out in one of the quotations from one of the pamphlets that you were looking at. And I wondered if you saw anything from Milton when he is cited. Does he talk about conscience differently than when he goes blind?
I mean, off the top of my head, that strikes me as a great study. I haven't maybe I've inadvertently been sort of groping around this idea, but I mean I like both of these ideas. I like, the idea of looking at some of these, State Department-esque letters, but also the idea of perhaps looking for a key term or descriptions of conscience more generally. I think that again would, there were a few, I don't want to say it more than once or twice, but there is certainly some present scholarship that I think, again, with this idea of blind language that Dar has come up with, I think that what you're saying could be really interesting in terms of that. But I would also like to maybe think of it, but also perhaps add a little bit more of the historical, let's say minor documentation, minor literary documents, but then also the philosophical component. So I could see both of these ideas as being deeply rewarding, and I think there are things that have certainly crossed my mind, but I have not deliberately went out and struck out at them yet. So I say now I do, now that you've mentioned it.
Other questions? Maybe could I ask you a kind of simple question? I think I've been working a lot on blindness in the 16th century in relation to painting and confraternities of the blind, and thinking a lot about the difference between sight as a metaphor, the kind of long history of evolving meanings that become associated with sight, versus something which is actually about the experience of sight. So, I mean, you've been getting questions about the kind of body, and you were talking about that. Could you just say a little bit about how you actually see navigating the relationship between the pamphlets and the kind of textual sources where they're using sight really as a kind of as a metaphor for something like clarity, as you said, and then how that kind of, how you work with that in relation to then thinking about Milton as somebody who was sighted and then becomes blind, because the kind of methodological thing is sometimes a little bit difficult. And I'm wondering, like, is it that there's metaphors in Paradise Lost that become something that is the connection, for example, or?
Yeah, there are a few parts in terms of some of the work that has been done in terms of looking at Milton's blindness, that I believe it's in book 3. There's a specific passage that is generally summoned when scholars are making a point in terms of Milton describing sightlessness after having gone completely blind. And I think for me, one of the connections with these early modern documents is sort of getting a taste of early modern London culture in the decades leading up to Paradise Lost, and how, and like I said, I hope this is the beginning of the project rather than some sort of standalone thing, but kind of, as all encompassing as possible in terms of looking at theological and literary documents, just to get a better idea of how sight is operating in Milton's mind by the time he does Paradise Lost. But I might make an analogy there in some of the stuff I've been doing with his Roman trips of 1638 and 1639. Like, perhaps analogously, the more I examine Rome and the Renaissance, and then the way Milton's writing after he returns, and then in his last poems, how he writes, there can also be, and I think there have been a few studies that are looking at similarities between literary language, political language, theological language in Rome and the Renaissance, in addition to various architectures in the Rome that he visited, and then also the description of things in Paradise Lost. So kind of trying to look in a literary historical sense of a survey of how is sight depicted, what is it correlated with, and in a sense trying to do the same thing with this Roman idea and some of the work I'm doing now, and how those typologies and so on seem to really come into this sort of grand sweeping epic scope once he has completely lost his sight. So is that helpful for answering the question?
Yeah, I think, I was in a way getting at a kind of dull question, which is about how you grapple with the difference between something that might be deemed context versus something which is about a kind of authorial position in a text versus actually the kind of actual language within the text itself. And so trying to figure out where the kind of real object of analysis is, if you like, of those three different things, and how you navigate that. But anyway, it was I think you answered that well, so thank you very much for that. Is there another any other questions? We still have time for another question to do. Yeah, super. Please go ahead, Miles. I think you're still you need to unmute yourself. Great.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been mute for so long, almost blinded by this talk. And I want to say, first of all, how fascinating it all is, Joseph. And, we've talked about this sort of on the edges, but seeing it all put together is just great. I wonder if you could, and just for those of you who don't know me, I am really stumbling here in this field because I am an Americanist, and hearing you all as specialists in the area, I realize that there is a gulf between us, as wide as the ocean even, but in many ways not. So I have two thoughts about this, and I'm wondering if you could expand or reflect on them. One is that blindness is has a moral dimension, particularly in the literature that you put up for us. Most often it's a metaphor of ignorance. and a kind of, obscurity intellectually. But there's also, there's the other dimension of the blind man as the seer, that whole side. And I wondered if you encounter these in juxtaposition in the works that you've read, or whether, they occupy entirely different realms. So that's one question. That's the moral question, you might say. The other question is about the aesthetics of blindness. And I am wondering, and you allude to a lot of matters that I'm sure, there's a whole iceberg underneath there of research. So I'm wondering whether anything like a poetics of blindness has, is part of the work that you've encountered. Thinking about Milton and just the whole idea of what, the poetics of a blind poet might be, particularly relating to some of the points you made about the repertory of sight, of vision that we accumulate as a kind of resource for description. And I was also struck by what one of the previous questioners referred to as the blind person's body going out into the world and sensing it in a way which is very different from the detachment of sight, you might say. And I'm thinking also of another blind writer of the 20th century, Borges, or another one, Joyce, and of the resources of the imagination that, it's tempting to say that somehow lack of sight is a possible enrichment of the imagination. Or maybe that's just a sentimental way of putting it. But surely the lack of sight affects the body, affects the mind, affects what the poet can imagine and write. So I'm wondering if, those things could be put together into something like a poetics of blindness. And I await your comments. And thank you again for such a great talk.
Oh, thank you very much, Miles. One thing that comes to mind is in terms of the morals, the moral question. I think part of the impetus for my survey of these documents is not only to better understand the history and all of the pragmatic reasons for doing so, and my own natural thirst for accumulating it, but there is a part of me that and like you said, I'm very much trying to not make this sentimental or anything, but having thought about this for some time, really looking at, I think I used the word apotheosis, and for me in the moral dimension, like there are variations on it. There are various writing styles, there are modes of text, there are pamphlets, books, sermons, everything else. But there is very seldom in my research, which again could be considered somewhat preliminary, there is very seldom a case where I come across an early modern document that is trying to give a rational understanding of losing sight, or is looking at it as saying, in a perfectly biblical view, right, that this must be the way of God and we should not be, perpetually making this a negative thing. But part of the reason it has to be there, I think, in aesthetics and morals is because when I'd mentioned the late antique and medievalism, in terms of the senses in these periods, its eyesight is constantly on top. It's been so drilled in a biblical and philosophical and literary poetical sense. But yes, at the same time, we have someone like Homer, more recently, someone like Joyce and Borges. But I think that what is so interesting about Paradise Lost to me is that it seems like this sort of colossal, epic rejection of the text itself existing seems to be an enormous rejection of the, let's say, almost pathological negativity associated with sightlessness. But since Milton uses as his topic, things such as, Satan as potentially being reimagined as actually an innocent figure. I find it hard to read Paradise Lost and not step away, trying to reconsider, what is the meaning of Genesis? What is this myth, or whatever we want to call it? For me, that's why I mentioned phenomenology as well. The morals, I think, in a sense, lead into this sort of eschatology. And in the poem, we begin to reconsider everything that's sort of been handed down. And the fact that it took Milton, going completely blind to get to this point, to be able to speak this into existence. I personally would think I'd love to read or write something that also took Borges and others into account and looked at it. But I'm aware we're at time, I think, too, but I hope that some of that is helpful, and if not, I think we'll be talking soon, so I hope that I can follow up and if it'd be more helpful if need be.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you all for your questions. And I also want to thank Joseph Nicolello again for his really interesting talk. So thank you very much from the audience who's here. And also to all of you for joining us today. We appreciate you very much tuning in for the talk, and look forward to another opportunity again. So thank you, and I'll see some of you soon, I hope.
All right, thanks everyone.